we are entering a period of time when the world will not be as open as it was just 2 or 3 years ago.
Kjell Nordström, welcome to PEXIP's Leading in a Changed World series.
Morning.
Thanks for joining us from your beautiful home in Stockholm in Sweden, and great to be talking to you from the other side of the world here in Australia.
This is fantastic, and it works.
This episode, we're calling it Corona the Time Machine, which ties in really nicely to a book that you've authored, which we'll cover in a minute. But just some background perhaps on who is Kjell Nordström.
I'm a doctor of business administration and economics, both actually. Focused my research on multinational companies and how small, tiny little organizations start to grow, develop, and become an organization that covers the globe. So that was actually something that I spent 15 years on, which is a long time, trying to understand that process.
And what did you find out in your 15 years of research in understanding that?
You know, that was actually the heydays of globalization, when the whole world was transformed from a nationally structured place, later regionally structured, and eventually beginning of 2000 became global. So the world was opening up like an oyster, and the companies were surfing that wave of globalization. Fantastic times for a researcher, actually, to surf that wave together with so many companies. Today, about 50% of world trade is within multinational companies or managed by multinational companies.
Now, you've authored a number of books on topics similar to this. In fact, I've been very lucky to get a copy of the pre-production manuscript of your latest book, which you've co-authored with Per Schlingmann. Now, you've called it Corona Express, an essay on time travel. And I want to read a passage that talks about this time machine that you reference. So you say here, in the spring of 2020, our view of the world was dramatically changed by the new bioterroristry. At the same time, it was hard to find a new understanding of the world order. 6 months and hundreds of conversations and books later, the contours of a new map could be seen. This gradually came into being when we divided up the changes we saw into two categories: the short-term, direct effects of the pandemic, and the more fundamental changes that are here to stay. What has been particularly interesting to see during this period is that certain changes are dramatically hastened by the progress of the virus. The pandemic seems to function like a sort of time machine. Suddenly, in some respects, it's 2030 or 2035. When it comes to using video conference platforms, we've been launched right into the future, like we're using right now. But you also go on to say that in other respects, we have been regrettably cast back in time to the end of the 20th century. Really keen to understand those two aspects and to delve into those a little bit more. You know, what have you seen leap forward by 10 or 15 years, and where has the world been cast backwards?
Now, if we look at everything from education to the way we are working, conferencing, sharing knowledge, we really transformed 2020 into something like 2030 very rapidly. And it's amazing to see how schools, universities, and all of us were able to use technologies like this in such a short time period. You know, no discussions, no arguments, just do it. Actually, we did it in many cases in a handful of days or weeks. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that. Now, both you and I know if we had tried to introduce technologies like this in education, established university or companies, it would have taken years. Probably 1, 2, 3 years, depending on what industry and what activity we are talking about. We did it now in a handful of days. Fascinating, I think. Outright fascinating. So that's one thing. The other aspect of this is, of course, that we are cast back to the 1980s in terms of that globalization process that I was talking about. We can see that flying, for example, here in Europe is back to 1979 in terms of number of passengers. Unbelievable. 1979. It's 45, almost 45 years back in time. And there is no reason to believe that we are back to the numbers pre-corona in half a year, 6 months, 12 months. Not at all. Why? Well, simply because the substitute to traveling is so powerful today.
Yeah, absolutely. What about in other aspects, in the social impacts or other things where we've been cast back? In fact, gone backwards in the time machine, not forwards.
Yes. So flying backwards, not flying backwards, but we are going backwards in that. We are back to the 1980s. Globalization, I would today talk about the regionalization of the world, not the globalization. Regionalization in the sense that you will get a Chinese zone, a US-led Western zone, etc. And then when it comes to wealth distribution, I think we have a struggle in front of us within our respective countries and internationally. You can see that Corona and the virus basically has speeded up a process towards a divided society. And this, we know from history, is a bad idea for countries as well as regions. And it's spelt unrest, seen over a longer period of time. So we will have to fight that, the uneven distribution of wealth. And to summarize, you could say, all of us on this planet, all of us, I'm talking about all countries, all tribes, people, what have you, are becoming richer. But some of us are getting richer faster, and that's the problem.
And do you think that Corona has accelerated that? Was that an inevitable process?
It was not an inevitable process, but the interesting thing with the virus and this Corona year is that it has speeded up processes that were known to us. This was known. This was discussed. But Corona speeded it up. And in a way, again, when we look back, we can say Corona didn't add anything. It didn't bring anything to the table, if you see what I mean. That was unknown to us. But my God, it speeded up processes in a, even to me, surprising way.
And so then it's those unknowns that have challenged the world, do you think?
I think it was unknown to us how powerful the technological infrastructure of some countries and regions actually was. We had built a Ferrari. We thought it was a Volkswagen, but it was actually a Ferrari. This part of the world where I am based, the Nordic countries, you know, last year in March, in April, we were saying to each other, look, this is a catastrophe. We will lose 30, maybe 40% of the GDP. And you know, that was on the news. And I guess you had the same discussions in Australia and in many other European countries. It was, and some people, you know, some of the pundits claim 50% of the GDP could be lost. Now, we came in here in the Kingdom of Sweden at minus 3%, Ben. Minus 3. That's nothing. Norway, minus 4. Finland, something like minus 3.5. That's nothing. Why? Because the technological infrastructure was there. And we didn't fully understand how powerful it was and how fast you could shift over and use substitute technologies. So this will be analyzed and discussed now for many years. how powerful the machine was that we had built.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? And obviously, with Pexit being based in Norway, their growth over that period of time is a perfect example of, that amazing platform that was already there that it's just now taken off because of the opportunity. So your research and consulting focus is in areas of strategic management with multinational corporations and particularly around globalisation. Obviously, 10 years ago, you were advising companies differently than you are today. What are you advising companies today about what the future holds for them?
In many cases, I'm advising them to stand back and reflect on the development in China, because we are entering a period of time when the world will not be as open as it was just 2 or 3 years ago. And to build those long supply chains where you are dependent on a certain region in China for critical components is probably not a viable strategy. You can't be too dependent on that region, on that country for the foreseeable future. Unfortunately, I should say. If you and I have had this conversation 4 or 5 years ago, I guess both of us would have said China is the future. Let's build something in China and be connected to China. Today, unfortunately, we are entering into a completely different era. So,
does it apply just to China? Does it apply just to China, or does it apply to any critical infrastructure or critical supply chain components that we need from other countries?
I think there are at least 3 or 4 drivers here. Number one is, of course, climate, and the fact that we all understand that we can't expect that we can transport stuff around the globe in that generous way that we did just 5 or 10 years ago. Globalization was driven by fossil. We shouldn't forget that. Transportation was primarily based on fossil. And that logic is coming to an end. I think we all understand that. And that basically means that we will build up supply chains in our respective corners of the world. Might it be Australia or North America or Africa or Europe, but we will see more of local supply chains. So that's one driver, climate. Second driver is, of course, digitization. We can manufacture things locally today with the help of technology. That basically substitute manpower. And the machines are sophisticated, they are fast, they offer short lead times. And today, companies like Uniqlo, H&M, or Zara for that matter, can manufacture stuff locally. And the costs are competitive. Zara manufacture most of what they sell here in Europe. Actually, also they have the manufacturing here in Europe. So it's amazing to see. So the first driver, climate. Second driver, digitization. We can do it. The third thing where I think it's impossible to make decent predictions is, of course, geopolitics and the fact that China and the US are trying to work things out. No one knows where we will end up with that political dimension. But it's also a driver, of course. Uncertainty for companies, multinational, local, it doesn't matter. Uncertainty we at all times try to avoid. Not become too dependent on something where it's too shaky. So it's a political, technological, and climatological wave that we are surfing.
Yeah, okay. So if you were going back into industry as a CEO, which industry would you choose to go back into based on opportunity?
Actually, to be honest, I think it's digital anything. And if you look at the stock market, it's unbelievable. And again, the time machine confirms it. 6 companies, the FANG companies, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Apple, plus Microsoft, it's basically 6 companies, account for 30% of the New York Stock Exchange today. Unbelievable. And that's one of the world's biggest marketplaces. And these 6 companies are now 1/3 of the value. And this will continue, driven by the fact that we now go regional, we give up certain dimensions of globalization, and we use substitute technologies.
Another quote from your book, you mentioned that our world has, in principle, up until our lifetime, consisted of lots of small worlds of their own, almost like islands. How do you see that changing? Or is it going back to that?
200 small islands, maybe 400 small islands, we call them nation states. But within those nation states, like Italy here in Europe, for example, is actually a divided country, north and south. Germany is a federal state. There are huge differences within Germany. So it's more than 200 countries if we look back at the 1970s or 1980s. I think the big change, Ben, the big one, is that we are coming to an end of the nationally structured world and entering an era of an urban world. A world of 600 cities, a world of 700 cities. No one really knows, but you can see the draft today to that world. And we will probably have as much as 75-80% of the world population in less than 500-600 cities. And that's a completely different place. It's small worlds, small urban worlds, but they are not structured necessarily along the lines of a language or a culture, because the city has always been, and probably always will be, a very diverse place. I mean, look at Sydney, London, New York, known for their diversity. Countries are not necessarily diverse. They could be rather ethnocentric and homogeneous, some of them, cities not. So in that sense, the future looks urban.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. Can we talk a little bit about the future, and particularly around hope? Because there will be a lot of people in the world who have, aren't as fortunate as us here in Australia and other parts of the world where things are not normal, but perhaps not too far from it. There'll be plenty of people where there's not a lot of hope yet because of the sickness and the virus that they're currently still seeing in their communities. And you say there is hope in your book, right? You say it's based on what we can achieve together. Can you explain that a little bit more detail for us?
Yes, I can. I think we are a case of a big ape. Humanity is. We tend to forget that over and over again. And you can go back to that fact every now and then to get some explanations to our behavior. We are lazy, which means that we don't like to change. We change if we have to. And evolution has designed us that way. So we conserve energy, but with enough pressure, we change. That's number one. Number two, back to your question. We are not very impressive as single individuals. We are not that fast. We are not that strong. We are full of flaws in the sense that we are afraid of things and we are a little bit nervous and what have you. So, not very impressive as single individuals. But my God, what we can achieve in groups. And might that group be a company, a city, a tribe, or a nation state or an army? But look at us when we get organized and get our act together, what we can achieve. Then we can send a man to the moon, we can and we will change the world and this planet, and we are doing it, unfortunately.
So for the leaders of those companies and those nations and those large and small groups of people, how should leadership change now and going forward?
That's a great question, Ben. And I think the big change, if we try to summarize 150 years of management, is that for 150 years, we have been looking for people with the right kind of knowledge that they could bring to the table. If it has been a media company or a steel company or any company or organization, has been looking for people with the right training, background, knowledge. Increasingly, we have built a planet where knowledge is almost freely accessible. It's ubiquitous, as you say in English. It's everywhere. Now, that changes the agenda for any leader. Now, you are looking for attitudes, not knowledge, primarily. And that's 180 degrees the other way around as compared to what we did historically. Today, we're looking for attitudes. Yesterday, we were looking for knowledge. And you're managing attitudes rather than a group of eggheads.
So for the aspiring leaders who aren't there yet, it's rather than them being promoted into a position of leadership based on their technical excellence in a discipline, you're suggesting that they may well be promoted into a leadership positions based on their attitude and approach to, their workplace or their company.
Yes, because knowledge is becoming like music. It's available 24/7 at almost no cost at all around the globe. Think Spotify for knowledge. Increasingly, we are entering a world where you have it at your fingertips wherever you are, which means you don't have to recruit people for their knowledge primarily. Of course, they need the basic training in this or that. But what you really are looking for, if someone is someone that can bring that organizational thing to the table, and the organizational thing translated into ordinary language is an attitude that works. You're a nice guy, you can sort out the conflict, you don't create too many problems, you see to that things are smooth around here. In organizational terms.
What's the concept that you talk about in your book, self-leadership? What do you mean by self-leadership?
It's basically the ability to, like any guerrilla warrior, to operate on your own for a long period of time, but you still know what the goal is, the overarching goal is. You don't forget that, even if you're cut off for 3 days, 3 weeks, or even 3 months. You know that you're on a journey and you know where you're going. You share the basic values of the organization. It doesn't really matter whether you're cut off from Apple headquarters for 2 weeks, 2 months. You still remember you're on a journey. I'm an Apple man or woman, and we stand for this and that and that.
Okay. And that then drives that self-discipline, that cadence around continuing while you're cut off or disconnected from the mothership.
Yes, and he again, the training we received or the training we gave people at universities and schools 10 or 15 years ago basically pre-assumed that they will go into an organization where they are managed by someone. There is a framework there that will take care of you every morning. During the afternoon, we do this. Now it's summertime, then we usually do that. Now, you have to self-organize. You're usually given an assignment, but no one is there looking over your shoulder telling you to do this or that. You sort it out. So it's a completely different ballgame, actually. And to be honest, when I look at this, it makes me rather inspired because this is a more humane way to organize work, actually.
It's fascinating. It's going to be lots of really interesting things to watch over the next few years, that's for sure.
Definitely.
Before we wrap up, I'm really keen to get some key takeaways from you for leaders who are watching this. Can you leave us with three key things that you would like to impart upon the leaders who are watching?
Number one, The future looks urban, female, and hot.
Okay, now you're going to have to explain that in a bit more detail. What do you mean? We've talked about the urban thing, but we haven't talked about the female thing and the hot thing. So you need to explain those ones.
We will live in cities, that's for sure, and we will probably have 70 to 80% of humanity in cities, which means that this is the marketplace of the future, the city. So the future looks urban, hot. Climate change is here to stay for the rest of our life, several generations probably. We all know that today. So urban, hot. In those cities, we can clearly see how women now are changing the political agenda, the economic agenda in almost all countries. And this is like a movement, and we shouldn't forget, it's 50% of humanity that in a way are coming out, if you see what I mean. Establishing themselves at the same level as men all around the world. And this is equally unstoppable as climate change. Urban, hot, female, easy to remember. And that's just number one. Number two, easy to remember. Look for attitudes, not knowledge. We used to go for knowledge, but now increasingly we go for attitudes when we hire people, human resources. And number three, my favorite, the art of making money. The art of making money actually boils down to one and only one thing: create a temporary monopoly. That's what business is about. To create that little monopoly position that might last for 5 years or 10 years, you never know. It's temporary, but it should be a little monopoly that you own.
Great, fantastic. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you for joining us in your morning, our afternoon here, and from Sweden, from your home. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you, Ben.